Hello and welcome to a special episode of NYSAC Live. My name is Mark Levine. I'm the Deputy Director of your New York State Association of Counties. Today, I'm joined by the members of your NYSAC legislative team to discuss the county impact of the recently enacted New York State budget. With me today are Dave Lucas, the Director of Finance and Intergovernmental Affairs, otherwise known as the Commissioner of Opinions, Ryan Gregoire, the NYSAC Legislative Director, and Patrick Cummings, NYSAC Counsel. Last weekend, after months of negotiations between Governor Hochul and the leaders of the State Senate and Assembly, legislators formally adopted the State Fiscal Year 2025 state budget. That was April 20th, 20 years into the state's fiscal year. The annual spending plan is the largest and most consequential piece of legislation enacted each year, with far-reaching implications to counties across the state. As the administrative arm of state government, counties are often tasked with implementing the decisions made in the state budget. So it's something that we, your staff, spend a great deal of time and energy studying and attempting to influence through negotiations. We'll be kicking things off by going through some of the priorities that were included in the budget, and then we'll circle back to the things that were not included in the final budget plan, but the things that we'll be fighting for the rest of session. Before we get into the details, though, in terms of a letter grade for how the state legislature did in terms of county impact, Ryan, can you give a letter grade to this year's state budget in terms of state mandates, which is the way we often measure state budgets?
Sure. I think if I were certainly to compare it to last year's budget, this would be an A+ slam run home dunk, right? Overall, probably a B, I would say, Mark. There's not a lot of new mandated costs, thankfully, right? Last year we got whacked with the EF map shift, cost shift, and with the increase in foster care costs. This year we didn't see that kind of dramatic cost shift. I think overall we had a couple good wins. We'll get into that in a minute. But I would give them a solid B.
Thanks, Ryan. Not a huge impact in terms of the mandates that we'll have to implement and pay for going forward this year. Dave, can you walk us through the top line spending numbers in the 2025 state budget?
Sure, Mark. We don't have financial plan details at this point. Excuse me. We'll have to wait probably a month before we see the actual data. But according to press releases, the top line spending is about $237 billion, which is about an $8 billion increase. And it's percentage-wise, it's not huge. It's 3.5%. I think what's more important here to track is what is the increase in general fund spending going to be? And we think that $8 billion increase is almost all general fund. We'll see when the financial plan comes out. But to put it in perspective, before COVID in 2019, the all fund spending was $168 billion, and we're up to now $237 billion. That's a 41% increase in a 6-year period. And on a general fund side, it's even higher. The growth is about 45%. So you're looking at almost 8% per year growth over the last 6 years. That is clearly not sustainable from a revenue perspective and a spending perspective, that you can't maintain that level of spending. If there's any downturn in the economy, there's going to be a lot of trouble in the financial plan. And because we contribute to the state's financial plan, it could be trouble for counties.
Thanks, Dave, for putting it all in perspective. $237 billion spending plan. It's risen essentially $67 billion in the last 6 years. Before we go any further, I want to let you know that you can download our county impact report, county budget impact report at www.nisac.org. It's right there on the front page. So please take a look at that if you want any details that we're talking about today, and there's a lot more in there. Ryan, in terms of general support for county governments, can you talk about how that has, how we're going to benefit or be impacted by the state budget?
Yeah, great question, Mark. One thing I want to start off before we get into some of these details is the state budget includes information that says total state spending on behalf of the counties outside of New York City. So I'm talking about the 57 counties. The state is saying, we are giving you $7.4 billion. What they're not saying in their documents, in their budget documents, is that the 57 counties outside of New York City are giving $5.5 billion to the state of New York, and that doesn't include the pension costs. When you include pensions, we're getting pretty close to that $7.4 billion, which is why we're always talking about a zero-sum game. That is the line from our executive director and our commissioner opinions. So I wanted to set the stage for our members to realize that that's not free money, right? You are, in fact, contributing quite an enormous portion back to the state of New York. Some positive impacts for this year, though. We do have a new allocation of $135 million broken into two different programs that we'll highlight here in a minute. One that has to deal with public safety, and the other one to support county infrastructure projects. We'll talk about those in a bit here. We also have some new funding for elections and some new funding for our district attorney offices to combat retail theft. So those are some new highlights, some new funding adds that we saw in this year's budget.
And as part of that $7.4 billion that the state says is on the plus side for county governments, is $3.3 billion that's attributable to the state takeover of local Medicaid costs, which happened early in 2012. So we always have to say thank you for that, because that $3.3 billion would be added into our property tax levy and be all going to the state of New York for the Medicaid program had the state not capped that 13 years ago. Back to you, Ryan, on local government assistance. Every year, cities, towns, and villages ask for an increase in the AIM funding. Can you talk about how our local governments and our communities are going to be impacted through AIM this year?
Sure. So, counties are not eligible for AIM, but certainly our towns, cities, and villages are. There is an appropriation in the aid to localities portion of the budget, $715 million. This year, though, there's a one-time add of $50 million. So that's a nice benefit that will be shared proportionately amongst our local government partners, which is great news for them. It helps relieve some of the pressures that they're facing at the local level.
Great, thank you. And stronger communities in our counties means stronger counties. So that's a nice add for the AIM program for our local governments. Local boards of elections, our counties run, operate, and fund our local boards of elections. Patrick Cummings, can you talk about the impact of this state budget on our local boards of elections?
I can. I actually missed my page, but I apologize. We've got more and more costs going up with our BOEs. And luckily this year, and with your work, with our work, they're providing us some funding. This is in the form of reimbursements, though, not straight shots. So know that we're going to be seeing 7.7 for prepaid return postage envelopes. And again, that is a spend you'll have to do, and then you can get reimbursed through BOE. $5 million for general operating costs, so more flexible funding. Again, a reimbursement. And then there's money out there, I think in a grant form, of e-poll book state aid of $14.7 million. So as we've seen costs go up and up at our polling sites and our election purposes, we're getting some money back. Then again, we've got expenditures that we've never had before. I mean, security costs are going up. How many employees we have at these polling stations have gone up. The number of polling stations, past years per county have gone up. So there's been a give and a take there. But we got some good news.
Mark, on that for the members, just so you're aware, if you're thinking, how am I going to get this money? We anticipate both the capital cost or the capital grant that Pat just mentioned and the operating aid will funnel to counties in a very similar manner as to what happened in 2020 after the early voting reforms were enacted. So we anticipate the State Board of Elections will distribute it in a very similar manner.
Great, thank you. And our boards of elections are running a lot of elections this year. It's a national election year, and so we have primaries, a couple of primaries, and early voting too. So there's a lot of activity happening in your boards of elections and some funding coming in through our state budget. So we appreciate lawmakers helping us fund those local elections. Ryan, in terms of back to government, general government, what about the countywide shared services program and other county partnership grant programs?
Great, Mark. These were two very important priorities that we got done in this year's state budget. The countywide shared services initiative, for those who have been through that somewhat painful process over the last 5 or 6 years, is set to sunset. However, and there's a big asterisk here, and this is where NISAC and certainly all of you leaned in really, really hard in the governor's office and the state legislature, plans that were submitted prior to January 31st of 2024 and those projects contained within those plans will be eligible to receive matching fund grants. So there's a reappropriate in the state budget so that they can fund those projects that have already been approved. Huge win for counties, particularly the 18 counties that had submitted plans last year. Your projects are good to go. You'll get reimbursement on that. The other big victory for our counties was the $135 million that I mentioned a little bit ago. Of that, $85 million is going to be directed to your county public safety answering points, your PSAPs, for targeted investments to help bring you up to speed with next-gen 911 technology. So you can use that $85 million to upgrade your PSAP call centers, your 911 call centers. The other $50 million can be used, it's a very flexible program, for county infrastructure projects. And there will be a max grant of $1 million per county. So think of projects, somewhere in the $500,000 to $1 million range. That funding will probably trickle through the Empire State Development ESD funding pool, and there will be some application. We have to see what those details are going to look like. But that is a new pot of money for counties, and it's very flexible. It can be used on pretty much any kind of infrastructure improvement you're looking at.
I have a question. Is it okay if I ask a question?
Please, jump
Ryan.
in.
So
Yeah.
$85 million is a lot of money for, excuse me, for 911.
It is.
What do we think the build out for getting to full 911 is, or enhanced 911?
Great question, Dave. So Commissioner Bray, I have to give a lot of credit to Commissioner Bray and the governor for pushing this hard this year. They recognize, the State Homeland Security Office recognizes that in order to achieve true next-gen 911 build-out across the state of New York, we're looking at about $2.5 billion present value. That's if we funded it today. Future years, that number obviously grows, Dave. So yes, $85 million is helpful. It's nowhere near enough to comply with getting us up to speed up for next-gen 911, but it's a step in the right direction. And it's on top of the grants that we're already receiving for the statewide interoperable communication grant program and the PSAP straight grant program as well through dishes. So this is new money.
Yeah, the state's been a great partner in terms of the Division of Homeland Security, and so their advocacy for this additional money is really helpful to counties as we implement Next Gen 911. Staying with you, Ryan, increases in terms of early child development special needs. The rates for early intervention, I know there was a lot going on in this in the negotiations. How did we end up here?
We actually ended up in a pretty good position, Mark. The governor in her executive budget proposed a 5% EI, early intervention provider rate increase with a 4% differential for rural areas. The state legislature came back and said, well, in addition to that, we also want to add on another 11%. So like a total of 16%, really. The enacted budget only includes a 5% EI rate increase. That's going to be split half and half approximately between the state and the counties. DOB estimates the state hit to be about $6.1 million, so we can expect a similar cost to counties.
And so, for those who are watching who may not know why this is, why we track this and the impact of this, tell us about this mandate and what the percentage is in terms of the state and the county percentage for this, for providing these services to those families with special needs.
Sure. So we are one of the few states in this country that requires counties to pay for the early intervention program, which covers children from 0 to 3. And think about speech pathology services, OT, PT, behavioral interventions, fine motor skill development services. That's the kind of program that early intervention supports. It's a federal program. There is no mandate that the state takes this on, but back in the early 90s, our state said, sure, we'll join in, and the state gets a match from the federal government for this program. But New York State said at that time, we're also going to require the counties to contribute into this program, and it's 51% state, 49% counties. But that number has gone up a little bit with new shifts within that program, so it's almost a 50-50 split at this point.
So any rate increase, half of the rate increase is covered by counties and local taxpayers for those rate increases, which is why we pay attention to that each year in the state budget negotiations. In terms of gaming, there's a bit of activity, so I want to turn it to Patrick Cummings, who is our liaison to the Standing Committee on Gaming.
Yeah, and why do we care about gaming? It's we've got casinos now in every region in New York State, outside of New York City, and there's a lot of infrastructure needs and support that goes with that. Because of that, local governments get funding from revenues produced by these casinos, both on the commercial side and the Native American side. There's some good news in some of this funding in the immediate. I do want to warn there's some clouds maybe in the future that we'll talk about, but in the immediate, we get around, after the state gets their share of the casino revenue, local governments get around $61 million, and that's based on the revenue the casinos get. There is a projection this year that that revenue is going to go up. Things have been better since COVID. Casinos are seeing more turnouts, and in the western counties, you get slot money from the Native American casinos. There's a share for commercial for all of that, and again, projections to go up. I think between in 10 to the teens percentage. That is not a guarantee by any means, right? These are projections. And then the second piece I want to point out is what I'm talking about with the clouds. There are some areas, the Seneca Nation right now, they are negotiating their compact, and their compact in part with the state is going to say how much they are going to share going forward. Those negotiations are going on right now. So there might be potentially more or less money shared to the state, which may make more or less to the state. Now, in the past, if we've gotten less share, so in the past, commercial casinos in the last few years have actually been some of them are paying less taxes to the state. The state has been good about, including this year, they included $17 million to cover those losses when we have it on a local end. If there's any worries about loss of revenue, say, in future compacts for any of these negotiations, we will fight to make sure that you're made whole. But that's not a concern for the immediate. In the immediate, you're going to be at least whole, we believe, this year with your gaming revenue on the county end.
Thank you, Patrick. 5 years ago, NYSAC advocated for a new program called the School Bus Stop Arm Safety Camera Program. This is adopted by a county for the school districts within that county. So we have about a dozen counties who have adopted this program, and the school districts then opt in. That 5 years ago, that program was created, and it sunset this year in 2024. The state budget includes an extension of that program for another 5 years to expire on December 1st, 2029. The intent of this program is to increase safety for the school children who ride school buses to and from the schools each day. We got a question on
I was just going to add to that.
Yeah,
too.
please
So
do.
ultimately, we're talking about tickets when a school bus stop sign goes up and someone drives by. I do know. I think it's about a dozen or so counties that have passed this local law to allow this. That have gotten to this program. That said, as Mark said, this started 5 years ago. And what was that? That was COVID. So when this law was passed, we didn't get that many questions in because there weren't school buses even running when it happened. It is starting to. If you haven't heard about this in your area, I expect this to be growing even faster than before. I think most schools are aware. They've talked to other schools that have done in other counties, and they're getting more and more comfortable with the program. So even if this wasn't applicable to your area in the past, I can see this program growing, and I think that's also why they extended it. Because they can see it getting bigger and bigger going forward.
And I believe this week is School Bus Safety Week. So this is, don't pass a school bus that is stopped, that has its red lights blinking and its stop arm up, stop behind, stop in front of those school buses, even on 4-lane roads. The state budget does have some language in there on the open meetings law and FOIL, especially for state and local authorities. We did get a question in yesterday regarding the meetings of county boards of supervisors and legislators. If those are all in person, there is no requirement to stream those meetings. If they are streamed for the accommodation of one of your board members, then it has to be streamed for the entire public in your community. Patrick, beyond the county board, what's in this year's budget impacts local authorities and state authorities. Can you talk about the changes or the what's in this year's budget to clarify streaming local authority meetings?
Yeah, first I'll say, we're early in the process of chewing on everything that happened in the budget, but we've already gotten probably, piece by piece, this might be the most questions we're getting in on an area. So I'll say this. Here's what we're promising. We've already talked to the Committee on Open Government, the state, and on May 7th, we'll get out word on this, but we're going to have one of their attorneys is going to do a webinar for our members to talk about the state budget changes and what Mark just talked about and what I'll just talk about, to give their perspective, to give clarification and opinion on what exactly they saw adopted. So there's some grays in here that we'll get more black and white with some experts coming in within a couple weeks. But in the meantime, the way I read it, that we're talking really, we're talking about local authorities. Certainly, probably the way I read it, IDAs, LDCs are going to be subject to FOIL and open meeting laws, and potentially even agents, other subsidiaries of counties, and there's been arguments and opinions out there that perhaps they always were. This, at a minimum, codifies that or potentially expands that, depending on how you look at that. But again, we're going to get clarification from the Committee on Open Government on that. And then also, there was one piece that Mark touched on that for your county officials and your boards. It changed so much on what you could do streaming-wise with these open meetings over COVID. And I know that the way the law ended prior to this budget, you could, if by local law, pass the ability to have a legislator be remote, and then they'd have to stream in. But that would have to be, unlike during COVID, that would have to be an extraordinary circumstance. A, you need to pass a local law. 2, you need to define what extraordinary circumstances are. and at a minimum, they're talking about someone that has a disability, someone that has gotten violently ill and can't make it, someone that has beyond normal child duties or parental duties that just they can't make it, and then you can opt into that as a county. So what this budget did was that extended that ability for your local law through 2026, and then with that, if you do that, so when, as Mark mentioned, I'll go with how I read it. I do not believe if your town or county did not stream anything prior and you just had open meetings to the public, I don't see anything in the budget that necessarily that says now you have to start streaming. Again, we'll get clarification on that. However, the way the law always worked is once you went into that option, then you are open to that. Now, if you do choose to stream, you need to make that open to the public. You do need to save that for 5 years. But the extension for that ability is what changed.
Great. Thank you very much. Last year, about this time, the U.S. Supreme Court made a decision that changed the way that counties and local governments across the nation foreclose on properties. These are tax foreclosures on properties. The decision made by the Supreme Court impacts every state in the nation. Dave, how does it? So, Dave, we needed changes in New York that would satisfy the decision of the Supreme Court. This year's state budget includes those changes. Can you talk about the changes that counties will now have to implement in order to abide by the Supreme Court decision?
Yes, thanks. The biggest issue here is, excuse me, what to do with surplus in a sale above the taxes and penalties due. That's what the Supreme Court ruled, that surplus has to go back. So we didn't really have a procedure in place in New York to do that. So the law establishes a procedure for interests and penalties and taxes due and administrative costs. The Supreme Court said reasonable administrative costs could be part of what is owed to the county to manage the property and to foreclose on it and get it through the process. And so that's what's kind of laid out. What we like about this proposal as it passed is that it keeps in place most of what we're already doing. So the procedures we're used to, the notifications we do, the notifications will be expanded a bit. That was part of the compromise with the legislatures. They wanted more notifications in the foreclosure process and more notifications to homeowners that might be in trouble about where they can get counseling or where they could get help, providing information to them, phone numbers, people, who to contact, all that. So there'll be a lot more notifications in the process. It also sets up a procedure for defining the administrative costs, which is good. And it also sets up a procedure for third-party lien holders. So there could be entities that have a lien on the property that might be owed something. And what would happen in this situation is the lien holders would be identified. If there is surplus, we would notify the court, and the court would determine how the surplus is distributed to all those different lien holders. And if there's anything left after the lien holders are paid, it would go back to the homeowner. So it's not a perfect proposal. It's new nationwide. There's going to be litigation pending on this, and Patrick could elaborate more on that. There's a lot of litigation pending already, or notices have been filed against many of the counties in New York. So we're going to work our way through this to the best of our ability. There'll probably need to be a cleanup to this legislation at some point in the future as we work through it. The courts will have some say in the process. But for the most part, we think it's workable under the current structure. It will potentially have more fiscal consequences for counties. This is not a surplus activity for the counties. A lot of parcels are sold at a loss. In the years during COVID, the auction process got a little weird, where people were bidding on stuff without even going and visiting the site. So that did change, but in prior years before that, a lot of parcels sold at a loss. And some of those losses were offset by the surplus. Why it's key to counties is we hold the school districts and the towns, and often a lot of cities and villages, harmless when they don't get paid for the property taxes. So that's the reason we have penalties, interest, and we go through the tax foreclosure. It encourages people to pay, and there's a penalty if you don't. And we want to make sure services are provided, and that's how we provide services is through the collection of property taxes.
Define for our audience what hold harmless means.
Yeah, like if someone's delinquent on they don't pay their school taxes, the county will pay the school district the taxes owed, so they can continue services uninterrupted. And this process lasts 2, 3, 4 years in some counties. So you're holding that school district harmless for multiple years. And to be honest, the school district bill in most counties is 5 or 6 times bigger than what the county assesses in property taxes. So it's a big burden. That burden's going to grow in the future potentially, but we need to work our way through this process and see
Can
how
you,
it comes out.
before we expand this conversation, this is one of the items in the state budget that is probably most complicated and will have most impact on the county government operations. So it's going to completely change or mostly change the way we foreclose on properties. Can you give us a ballpark of what when we're holding harmless school districts, towns, and villages and cities, how much is what is that on aggregate across the state of New York?
Yeah, it's a pretty big number. The last year we have good data for is 2022, and taxes that reach delinquent status. What happens is the original jurisdiction, like a school district, we all get. Well, if you're using an escrow through your bank, the bank gets the bill. But if you're a person that pays your property taxes directly, you get a bill from the school district in the fall. You pay the bill. For towns and villages, you probably get something in the early start of the calendar year, and you pay the bill. So the original taxing jurisdiction collects taxes, and whoever's delinquent, they don't get paid, they just turn it over to the county, and the county is responsible for collecting that money. So the amount of delinquencies that are turned over to the county, in 2022, it was around $500 million. So most of that does get collected, but $500 million is a big number. So just think if you collect 80% of that, you're still short $100 million. And that tends to be what counties write off in aggregate in any given year of that taxes. They just say, we're never going to be able to collect. We can't sell the parcel. There's a lot of reasons this happens, but it is a big amount of money. There's a lot of risk involved in this, and we'll see how the process works out under the new rules as we go forward.
I just want to emphasize one thing for our members on this that are listening to Dave's remarks. Without the advocacy of the members and the association, this proposal looked far worse during negotiations. And what I mean by that is we were successful in beating back a few proposals that would have ballooned that $100 million impact to something much, much larger. There was a proposal on the table to lower the delinquent property tax interest rate penalty. Right now, most counties assess somewheres around 14%, some are as high as 18%. They were going to put in a cap that would have dramatically lowered that almost, to what you could beat in the market. So that would have actually shifted an incentive where people would have gone and taken the money that they would have paid for their taxes, and you could have gone and invested that and made more money and just paid the interest. So that didn't make sense to us. We got that beat back. There was another provision that would have exempted seniors, disabled individuals, veterans from ever being foreclosed on. And if that's the case, why would you pay your taxes? If you're never going to be foreclosed on, what's the incentive to pay? And the third issue that we eliminated from this law was the ability for a homeowner to pay in reverse chronological order. And what I mean by that is they could have been in arrears, meaning in late payments, for 2 years at a minimum, if that proposal had been included, which would have meant we would have been having to keep these other municipalities whole for an additional 2 years. Yeah. So that 100 million would have became 300 million. All of that was excluded, not included in the enacted budget. And those are huge wins.
Great. Thanks. And I just wanted I'm going to kick it over to you, Patrick, for some comments. Dave mentioned the litigation. So some counties, this all started with litigation that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. where a woman sued that the county foreclosed on her property, and the county made money, and the money did not go back to her. There are some lawsuits now, at least notifications of potential lawsuits against counties for these back payments or the extra money that was. So, Patrick, can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, but I'm going to actually sort of tag on one more thing that Ryan and Dave that worked so hard and the county officials on winning, and that was the provision on how you find true value on these homes when we do this process. And we got a or, not an and statement. And what I mean by that is your counties, when we're selling these, we can sell them at public auction still, or we can use an assessment model, or we can use an appraisal model. And now that is huge, because especially for land banks, we got a ton of questions on land banks. And how can we keep going, as you have in all your communities, the counties and cities work closely with their land banks on picking certain properties that they want to rehab and put back to a public use and or back on the tax roll. The way that happened in the past is they would get together and pick the parcel after the county or city took the property, and that was that. So when and if the property owner sells rights in that property or for the overage, how is the land bank are they gonna have to become just another bidder? The answer it's gonna still be it's gonna be difficult. They're gonna have to be more selective. However, the fact that we can do an appraisal model will allow us to go in and do an appraisal, and if we can prove that money that property is less than the taxes owed, we can just then hand that to the land banks. Would be the way I think most could proceed with that. If there's money over, you could still then give that to the land bank, but then one entity, whether it be the land bank, whether it be your municipality, would have to make sure that they're reimbursing the individual homeowner. But there is a path forward for land banks with the way this worked out. As far as lawsuits, we have dozens of counties that are currently in a class action lawsuit for back pay owed, the back paid for taxes that we've kept in prior years under that system. The rest of your counties, if you haven't been part of that suit, you're getting individual notice of claim. So there's been filing in almost every county. Basically, the claim in a real nutshell is saying if this was unconstitutional in 2023, this was unconstitutional in 2021 as well, is the argument of the plaintiff, and therefore the county keeping the overage needs to reimburse that individual. And then there's an argument on and how far back is that look back period? Is it 3 years? Is it 6 years? Is it more than that? That is ongoing right now, and I think that we are battling that lawsuit, and I think it's 13 counties have combined right now. But please contact me. I can get you information on where those suits are at, what attorneys are working on that. NISAC is helping with these lawsuits. We're trying to help the counties out. But that is this law change doesn't necessarily eliminate these lawsuits. These are ongoing, and I would see them as two separate issues. They'll certainly help with some arguments in the lawsuits going forward, but they don't negate them.
Thanks, Patrick. Again, there's a lot involved in the changes to the foreclosure process, and we will all collectively work through them. George Hebert, thanks for asking the question. What I didn't say at the top of this is that if you have a question, you can submit that on Facebook, and we'll do our best to answer that through the process. George, you asked a good question in terms of the increase over the 6-year period from about $170 billion full spending to 237. That's a $67 billion increase. George asked about the increase in revenues during that same 6-year period. And I know this was also included the COVID era and some federal funding that came into counties and the states through that period. So, Dave, can you talk a little bit about the rise in revenue over that same six-year period?
Yeah, it's a good question. And in all funds, the $67 billion increase, for the most part, revenues did increase that came into the state. The biggest issue, though, is there was a huge amount of fiscal stimulus coming from the federal government and direct aid to the state and counties. Counties received over $2 billion in direct aid. New York City received about $3 billion in direct aid, plus other pots of direct aid that basically became general fund for each entity receiving the money. It was highly flexible. The state of New York received almost $12 billion in direct aid, and then another $10 billion on top of that in Medicaid enhanced FMAP. Counties benefited from that over a multi-year period. We got a few $1 billion out of that. Again, that just became more general fund. The problem we have is we have the $67 billion, where a big chunk of the money was one-time federal revenue that is no longer available. And even the money they gave to individuals to allow them, small businesses and individuals got direct grants. Some families got $18,000 or $20,000 in federal funds over this period of time, which allowed them to continue. That was the whole purpose, was let's not collapse the economy. Let's make sure people can pay their bills. That money's all working its way through the system now. So the fear we have is the structural deficits once the federal money is gone, and once all the individuals and small businesses out there have spent through the federal money, which for the most part they have, how are we positioned? And where we're seeing it the most is in Medicaid right now on the state side, because much of that spending occurred and the program grew using one-time federal revenues that haven't really come down since then. The program's still at this level, but the federal money's not there. So the state's now looking for ways to pay for the Medicaid program. So that's the concern that we have, and a lot of the budget advocates have about the state financial plan is, with all these one-time revenues gone, they do have reserves that they've never had before, and that's great. The reserves are meant to handle a economic crisis, not a spending crisis. So that's the concern we have.
Thank
But
you.
it's a great question.
Thanks. Great question. And staying with you, Dave, pension reforms. There was a lot of negotiation through the last a month on changes to Tier 6, when we have most of our employees at the county and now New York State employees that are in this new tier called Tier 6. Dave, what were the final changes in the state budget for Tier 6?
Yeah, there were multiple bills. I just have to step back for a moment. Two things. There were multiple bills in this situation that were in play. Some of them are sitting in the legislature and might be addressed in the end of session. And because they have a fiscal consequence for the state, my guess is the governor will reject those,
Right.
because there are financial implications. And the other thing is, for county government, about half of your employees are Tier 6 today. So Tier 6 was implemented in 2012. We're 12, 13 years later. About half the county workforce right now today is Tier 6. So when Tier 6 started, the idea was the costs were out of control a little bit on the pension side. Right after 9/11, we had a recession. But right before 9/11, the state did huge expansions of the pension benefits, where they made Tier 4 much more beneficial to pensioners and for state workers. The problem was the growth was just dramatic. County costs grew 2,400% over a decade, mainly to support the benefits. The problem is, when you have a recession or a downturn in returns in the investment fund, the employer makes up the contributions for the shortfall. So that's what happened. It grew by 2,400%. And that's why the state said in 2010 and 2012, we need to reform the program. We're going to pull it back a little bit, return it to what it was before 2000, mainly along those lines, is what they're trying to do with Tier 6. So there were multiple bills pending. The one that finally did get enacted in the budget was what they did is, right now in Tier 6, they look at a retiree's last 5 years of service, and they take an average, and that determines your final average salary for calculating what is your annual pension going to be. Under Tier 4, that's 3 years, so they went back to the 3-year proposal. It's not a huge increase. I mean, from a present value perspective, it's over $1 billion, but on an annual recurring basis going forward, it might be $25-30 million for the 57 counties. New York City is hit a lot harder with it because they have way more employees. They have all the teachers, all the firefighters, all the police. That's all under one umbrella. their annual cost is going to be about 200 million to start, and it's going to grow each year thereafter. But there was a lot of other proposals that didn't get enacted. But we do need to remember why Tier 6 was enacted. It was because it had become unaffordable. For counties, the cost went from 50 million in 2002 to 1.2 billion by 2014, because we were still paying, even though 2012 was when the change happened, we were still paying for the past benefits. So that's a dramatic increase. It's over $1 billion increase. So the state was having even a bigger problem because they had more employees, and the city was as well. So that's the reason they made those changes. It was to reduce the long-term costs. So there's been other changes to Tier 6 before this. In 2022, they lowered the 10-year vesting in Tier 6 back to 5 years, which is a Tier 4 change. They made some changes during COVID about overtime hours worked. Those are small little things. But those things combined, the Tier 6 changes, have reduced the savings to counties, local governments, and the state by about 1/3. So we need to be careful as we go forward about, if we keep tinkering with this, we know there's been a lot of issues about recruitment and retention, and we have to look at pensions versus recruitment. Does it help with recruitment? Does it help with retention? That's something we have to look at. But these costs, there was a reason why it happened, and we just need to be careful financially going forward. If we have another big recession or loss in the fund, the contributions rise dramatically.
Yeah. And if passed as prologue, we can expect that the legislature will continue to tinker with Tier 6 going forward. Pat, can you talk about cannabis and the changes to the Office of Cannabis Management and how they impact counties and cities going forward?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've gotten a lot of calls over the last couple of years of it's across the state. We've got cannabis shops that are operating illegally. They're operating without a license and wanting more tools to try to help shut them down. The state, OCM, they have the ability to inspect and shut down these businesses already. In the state budget, they're allowing counties and cities, not towns, counties and cities, not towns or villages, to pass a local law. If you pass a local law and opt into this, they will give you that municipality the ability to do inspections of operations that they believe are selling cannabis without a license. You can go and inspect those stores. If you find that, once you enter those during operational hours, you have the ability to shut those operations down. You can fine them. You can close up the shops. So it's giving a civil tool, not criminal tool, to counties and cities to stop some of these unlicensed operations.
If you haven't figured it out yet, we could talk about this all day. So if you're still with us, thank you very much. And we're gonna move forward a little faster. If you have questions, you know where we are. You can call our offices. You can email any of us. Ryan, can you talk about the changes in terms of the state correctional facility closures and the raise the age in terms of public safety?
Sure. So the governor has 1 year until March 31st of 2025 to make a decision. She can, with 90-day notice to the public and the legislature, make a decision to close up to 5 state prisons. Your next question that you're going to ask me is, Ryan, where are they going to be? I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you. But the governor does have up to a year to do that. On raise the age, there's another $250 million appropriation in this year's budget. There's reappropriations of $842 million, which goes back to fiscal year 2019. And the new thing for this year is New York City will be an eligible municipality to tap into that $250 pool of money.
Great. In terms of highway funding, it's pretty much level to last year. The win here for local governments is that when the governor introduced her budget proposal, she had reduced some things that were added last year by the state legislature. So in the end, it's the same as you got last year, but it's about $200 million more than the governor proposed in January. So we count that as a win in our win-loss column, But in terms of comparing last year to this year, it's the same amount of funding. Now I want to talk. Now, if you have questions about the budget, please let us know. But now is when we shift. Your association shifts to start advocate for post-budget legislative priorities, county priorities in a post-budget capital. So, Ryan, what can we look for in terms of the major issues that were maybe being negotiated in the budget but were not resolved? So, what are we looking at for the rest of the session?
Sure. So we can dive more into this in a future video, so stay tuned for that. We're also going to be having our post-budget legislative program made available on May 6th. It'll be sent to the state legislature. We'll have it on our website. We encourage you to use that as a tool when you meet and engage with your state delegation. But there are a couple priorities that we were really pushing very hard on during the budget process that did not make it in the final deal. One of which was the ability to collect sales and hotel motel occupancy tax on vacation rentals. Think of your Airbnb and VRBOs. That was a lot of revenue that the state left on the table for themselves and unfortunately for us. There's nothing in the budget that regulates this industry. We're looking to level set this with our existing hotel providers. It's an equity perspective that we're coming at this with. They should be treated no differently than anybody else. The other big component of our advocacy during the budget process was our rescue EMS package. We've actually drafted a resolution that you all can adopt, and we're going to be sending that out to counties in the coming days. However, there were no reforms to the emergency medical services in this year's budget. We have a package of bills. We're going to be pushing those bills post-session. We have commitments from the legislature that they also want to do the same. We just have to get it across the finish line. And getting it across the finish line, as everyone knows, is not as easy as, saying just pass the bill. There's over 21,000 bills that have the potential to get over the finish line. There's a couple other provisions in this that we have to keep an eye on. There may be some changes to Supreme Court justices. We may see some legislation that increases that, to be determined. The governor proposed a constitutional amendment. Pat and I don't really think it's going to look identical to that, but there might be some tweaks. There's some other post-budget priorities, but again, we're going to have all of this in our post-budget program, Mark. So I would encourage folks, stay tuned. Keep an eye out for it. Read the county perspective. Read the NISAC news updates, and that's going to be the best way to find that information.
So this has been a special edition of NISAC Live to talk about the county impact of the 2025 state spending plan. We're available to answer any additional questions you may have. You can reach out to any of us by email or give us a call. In the meantime, we are starting the process to advocate for your needs post-budget through the end of session. Session ends the end of the first week of June. So thank you for tuning in today, and we look forward to seeing you in the future.